Before we get started, I want to say thanks to all the sponsors. I don't know if you know what goes into putting on a conference, but it's a lot of work and a surprising amount of money. You would not believe what conferences get charged for Wi-Fi. It's disgusting. So be sure to stop by the sponsor booths, show them some love, give them some thanks. They're what keep the conference ticket prices affordable for you all. So definitely stop by and check out their booths. A little bit about me if you've never heard of me, which is totally cool because I'm not from here. My name is Jennifer Wadella. You can follow me on Twitter at @OMGIt'sFetty. 9 to 5, I'm a remote software engineer. JavaScript is my happy place. Been rocking Angular at my most recent startup. I'm a nonprofit founder and director, so I run a nonprofit called Kansas City Women in Technology, trying to get more women in tech careers. We run like a fuck ton of programs. I'm an international speaker, and because I work from home, I get to be an aspiring crazy plant lady. So a little bit about me in a nutshell. I do like to warn people that if you follow me on Twitter, just beware, like Monday nights I watch The Bachelor, I live tweet, this is your one warning, sorry not sorry. I am from Kansas City. You might know us for our most valuable export, Paul Rudd. Yeah, good shit. It was great. Like when we were in the World Series, of course he was there like watching the game and they interview him on camera and he's like, "Kegger at my mom's house." And it's kind of fun because his mom is actually like still a school teacher at one of our like public school districts and like the nicest lady. So fun times. Anyway, Kansas City, good place. But we are here today to talk about Angular forms and why they got to be so damn complicated, right? And like for web forms and interacting with them being such a basic part of like application building, like there should not be this much drama, which is basically why I created this talk, is because I had switched all our forms to reactive forms and then I was trying to implement a type ahead and it took me like longer than 2 minutes and I was like, this is stupid, this should not be this complicated. How do I get around this? And then I found this really obscure interface that I'm going to imbue you all with the power of today. Has anybody heard of the control value accessor? Okay, 1 or 2 hands. Well, the rest of you, get excited. I'm going to solve all your problems. Well, at least all your Angular form problems. But, okay, let's talk about the basics. How many people in here are using template-driven forms right now? It's okay. I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to make fun of you. This is a safe space, y'all. Okay, how many people are using reactive forms? You don't have to know. You can just give me a meaningful glance if you don't know which kind of form you're using. Okay. All right, so quick overview. When we talk about template-driven forms, these are your more traditional, of course, template meaning more in your markup-driven forms that really got carried over from Angular 1. So if you were on an Angular 1 project and transitioned over into Angular 2, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever, this is what you might have started using. Your just basic forms module, and everything, again, is going to be in your template, and you're going to be in your model, and you're going to be binding to your ng model. So it was fine. But I feel like it can get really messy really easily, and there's just not a lot of manipulation you can do that is very transparent and readable. So template-driven forms, like, meh, not my favorite thing in the world. I am really big on clean and readable code, especially at my last job. It was like me, the only front-end developer, and then a couple back-end guys, and then they would jump in and like fuck up my code and re-implement validation from scratch. And I'm like, no, stop, don't do that, don't do that. So a lot of what I do is try and make my code as readable as possible. So I'm like, please, don't mess this up, so I have to clean up your mess like when I get back in town. Okay, so if we look at reactive forms, we've got a reactive forms module, so not too different there from our implementation standpoint. But the great thing is we're going to be controlling this in our component code. So we're going to be instantiating our form groups and our form controls and our form arrays and everything just like that. And so the great thing is it's very transparent, very readable, and we can easily manipulate it for all the different situations we're going to run into. So this is what our markup looks like. The only difference you're going to see is we're binding to this form control name. And that's going to give us all the power, and it's going to give us very nice, clean, readable code. Like, okay, I know that this is the input for my URL, and that is all I'm going to have to mess with. All right, so reactive forms. Yeah, we're going to talk about reactive forms today. The problem is not everyone has caught up to like the awesomeness that is reactive forms, and y'all know, like, as JavaScript developers, especially in like framework land, we can be a little too heavily dependent on plugins and libraries and tools because who wants to reinvent the wheel all the time? And if you do want to reinvent the wheel all the time, you're going to like hate everything I have to say, just FYI. So the problem is sometimes those libraries wouldn't have caught up to the way that reactive forms are meant to be used and implemented, which means sometimes we have to get a little crafty and work around things. So we're going to talk through a couple complicated problems today. One complicated problem, I need dynamic required fields. You know, I would love to live in the perfect world where like docs are written clearly and concisely by people who understand like how the web page works, but I'm also a very pragmatic realist, and I know that doesn't freaking happen, and I'm going to pick and choose my battles, right? So I'm going to give you all some solutions that are for our less than perfect world than we live in, and if you're working in a perfect job where this isn't drama for you, let me know where I can apply. Okay, I might need custom validation rules, again, because I've got requirements that are kind of messy and they want some crazy stuff that's going to depend on different rules and how I need to be setting validation in my form, so we'll work through that. What if I need to display one thing in an input field for my users, but I need to submit a different value to my form, and I don't want to get like messy and tied down in a bunch of event emitter drama? Okay, what if I have a bunch of checkboxes and need to submit an array? And yes, I understand that, like, you know, typically you should have a value associated with the checkbox, but let's be real, that's not how the backend guys are writing the API, and I need to, you know, it's just less drama for me to figure out how to submit to them in the way we need to, so we're going to call it good there. And finally, what if I need to dynamically create and remove form controls and form groups as I'm building out some really complex, robust UI of different forms and trying to submit that into a cohesive way that I can also come back in a month and a half later when they have a new request to add and understand what the hell I wrote in the first place? All right, so here are our problems we're going to talk through today and how they got so damn complicated. I feel like I'm not getting enough laughs from like my Avril Lavigne jams here. Like, come on, y'all. She just put out a new single, by the way. So if you want to take a photo of this right now, this is where the demo code is. So as we talk through everything, like, don't worry about taking notes. Don't freak out about that. If you want to go through, I've got the demo code. It's well commented, so you can kind of go and play with it at your own time. I know for me personally, like, I'm that kind of person that like has to go and get my hands dirty and really play with things and figure it out. So I want to make sure that we're serving that audience too. All right, so problem number one, I need dynamic required fields. I forgot my clicker and it's killing me. All right, so let's say we've got two form values and we only want one to be required if the other one has a value. So I've got, this is kind of pulled from my app. I did like a recipe, like meal prep picker app because I wasn't feeling very creative that day. But I've got, let's say, just a random input and it is my categories. And so I have requirements that say, okay, if this category field has a value, then I want to go ahead and I want to require my subcategory field. Okay, so you will notice that I don't have any requiredness in my markup because we don't do that with reactive forms. So here's what we're going to go through and do. We're going to go ahead and we're going to build our form, and this is just my preferred method. There are a bunch of different ways that you can use the form builder group, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull out all my fields. And so you'll notice subcategory is the one we're going to be dealing with right now, and I don't have that one required at all. My name field is required, but subcategories is not. And the great thing is reactive forms just make it so easy for us to go in and do dynamic changes to this. And then you'll notice I've written this onChanges function, which is where I'm going to put all my listener code for when my form values change. All right, so step one, the first thing we care about is understanding and knowing when the form value changes so then we can make our logic decisions. So in my onChanges function, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to subscribe to my input value that I care about category. And on value changes, that's what I'm going to subscribe to. And then I go ahead and I'll just populate the value parameter in case I need to do some custom logic based on whatever value that might be. My last startup, I was working on it was a legal tech app, and it was basically like a glorified freaking document management system for lawyers on the litigation process, like that. But I got to write JavaScript, so that made me happy. But they would just have these like insane nested form fields, and if you had like this kind of case and it was in this kind of court system, then you needed to populate like X, Y, and Z values, and so it was just like requiredness dependency hell, and reactive forms made me very, very happy. All right, so step two, we're going to get the field control that we care about, and we're going to use the set validators method to determine whether we want that to be required or not. So what this is going to look like is we've already subscribed to our value changes on the field we care about. So then we're going to go into our form, and we're going to get our subcategory control, which is what we care about. And then I've just written some really basic code here where if we have a value, we're going to go ahead and we're going to set our validators to be required. But if there's not a value, we don't want those validators, right? Or maybe like the user is clicking around in a form because we all know the user is an idiot and God knows what they're going to do. So then if there's not a value, we're going to go ahead and set our validators null, and that's going to remove all our validators. And right now I'm just using basic, like, you know, Boolean is required, is not required. We'll talk about a little bit more complicated validators in a minute. But super basic, not too hard, right? Yeah, maybe not so complicated. Okay, step three. What if a user has already started to interact with our form, right? And so they've already triggered Angular's validation and have like already moved past a field that should or should not be required. Well, we've got this tricky little method called our update value and validity, which is going to assess the current state of our validators on our input and then revalidate accordingly. So little gotcha there that you do not want to forget. So what if, once we have that first value selected, what if we want to preset data based on whatever that value is? Like I talked about the lawyer app and they wanted all this pre-populated stuff. Super easy as well. So we're already subscribing to our value changes, right? We've got the input that we want to manipulate our subcategory. We can go ahead and just use the patch value method to pre-populate whatever data and do that based on whatever logic we need to get that going. All right, validation. What about some validation after the fact? All right, is everybody fairly familiar with Angular validation classes? Yeah, so these are what Angular is going to give us with default. Like if we're not doing any like custom quirky shit, if we're just using like Angular validation as it was intended, this is everything we have access to us that we don't even think about, it's going to be handled for us. So seriously, y'all, like let Angular do the heavy lifting. Do not re-implement validation on your own. Do not like re-implement. It will do all the work for you if you're just smart and you read the documentation. All right, so my preferred validation when I'm in charge of UX decisions, I have a background in design, and so like doing mostly front-end UI work, I'll get punted to make those choices every so often. I'm going to go ahead and set my classes, and so if a field is valid and if it is required, like my default border saying it's good is going to be green. But if it's been touched and it's invalid, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set that border as left. The reason I like to do this is I like to do it after a user touches a field, because if you start with all your invalidated fields highlighted in red, the user's like, dude, calm your tits. I haven't even like gone through the form yet. So that's just kind of my preference. But this leaves us with kind of a tricky question, right? Because what happens if a user just doesn't touch any fields and they're all required? Like, how do we control that? Not that big of a deal. We just need to go through and highlight all our invalid untouched fields on our save button, which is my preferred interaction. So we can actually do this really easily. We can just use object.keys and go ahead and iterate through our form controls. Our form control is essentially just an object, everything in JavaScript, right? We can iterate through those form controls, get the control, and then just set control marked as touched. You set only true, so it won't affect the rest of the form. You can just do it like individual piece by piece. Boom, we've got our validation handled for any custom drama we have going on. So this is going to update as long as we're doing that update value and validity. That will cover all our bases. All right, problem number 2. I need custom validation rules. Of course I do. I feel like they've been updating a lot of our validators at our disposal, but like this is your most basic validation. This is how you set your validators. And your validators.required is just simply like is required is not required. But we can also do min, we can do max, we can do required true. We can do an email that's built in, so you don't have to build your own email regex, min length, max length. Pattern is really the only one I'm going to talk through today, but again, like when in doubt, read the documentation, make sure you're not reinventing the wheel when it comes to forms or validation, because there's really not a lot you should have to custom build on your own. All right, so pattern validation a couple ways. Because I feel like I end up using regexes more and more, and I know how much people hate regexes. Like, you either love them or you hate them. I happen to love them. But to be a considerate human being, I really like to put mine just in a variable that's very cleanly labeled. This is my date pattern. That way, somebody else coming in and reading my code who like cries himself to sleep at night anytime they have to touch a regex can like understand, all right, this is what she's doing, instead of having to go and Google. And then I can just pass that into my validators.pattern function, and that'll handle my regex. The only thing you need to worry about is when you're passing in a regex, it's going to pass it in as a string, so you need to double escape it to make sure that it can be parsed properly, or that will troll the crap out of you, especially if you're like trying to like do your code before you'd have had enough coffee in the morning, and like I can't even type Docker right in like the console. You all know how that goes. All right. So speaking about regexes, has anybody seen regex crossword games before? You will lose so much time of your life. It's so much fun. It's the most entertaining thing ever. And it'll really help you not hate regexes as much. But this is really cool. So like you can go through and do these little tutorials and figure out what does this one have to be? You got it? All right. Yay! We can move on to the next. Oh, to save my progress, I'm not logged in right now. But anyway, yes, feel free to waste your life on there. It's a lot of fun, and hopefully will make you hate regexes a little bit less. All right, let's talk about function validation, though. What if we are wanting to do some sort of validation based on other dynamic inputs in our fields that are constantly changing? Well, we can actually pass a function in, which is really cool. Like, let's say I have some arbitrary value that I want to make sure is greater than 340. Well, I can go ahead and use that and build a custom validator and pass that into my form. Again, default functionality built into Angular, y'all. We're not doing anything crazy here. So, yay for function validation. All right, problem number 3. I need to display one thing in an input field to a user, but then I need to submit something else. And I feel like this is the story of our lives as front-end developers, right? Is showing the users what they want to see and doing all the pretty magic on the back end where they don't have to worry about. So very likely use case. I'm using a library, and we all know, like, you've sat there and evaluated the decision of, all right, what's the energy it's going to take me to rip out this library, find something that works, figure out how to re-implement it, and make sure I do it across our entire app and don't break any unit tests. Right? It's entirely possible that it might not play nicely with reactive forms. So this is where our hero enters, the control value accessor. And the only reason I even found out about this is because I was struggling with this problem, and I was like, all my workarounds were just like hacky, and I was like, this is stupid, there's gotta be a better way to do this. And so out of sheer desperation, I hop into the Angular Buddy Slack, and I like started explaining my problem. And one of the core contributors is like, oh, you just need the control value accessor. I'm sorry, it's not very well documented. And I'm like, okay. So I'm going to impart that knowledge to you all today, and I'm so excited. It's not as scary as it sounds. It's just a way to build a custom input. The docs define it as an interface that acts as a bridge between the Angular Forms API and a native element in the DOM. And that's what we care about, right? Displaying one thing in the DOM to the user, but submitting something else for our actual form value. So if we look at the CVA interface, pretty basic. We've got these three methods: write value, register unchanged, register untouched. I bet you can guess what each of those do. But just in case, I'll let you know that write value writes a new value to our element, so that's how we're going to propagate our changes up to our form value, right? Register unchanged is going to register a callback function when the controls value changes. This is important because this is going to feed again back into our out validation and mark that field as touched. Unchange, or excuse me, well, it'll mark it as changed in untouched, and then untouched is going to mark our value as touch. So if we touch it and then don't interact with it at all, then we can go ahead and make sure we can preserve that, that validation and all the default functionality that Angular gives us. All right, so CVAs are really great for like a very granular control of displaying to the UI and communicating with the Forms API. So this will allow us to create a lot of really amazing custom wrappers that can provide us all the functionality we leave while just simply fitting it back to our form and not having a lot of drama to worry about. All right, so a couple key concepts when we're creating our CVA components. Keep your wrapper components dumb. All we want to do is we want to input a value and output a value to the form. Like if you've got validation, if you've got complicated logic or something that's going to change based on the parent form, keep it out of your control value accessor wrapper. Leave that to the parent for the logic handling. All right, so let's get back to our initial problem. I want to display a name in my type ahead and submit an ID, but my library doesn't allow for that. And so this is a specific problem I ran into where I was like, really, it's 2018 and this is causing me problems? You gotta be kidding me. So, you know, we've seen this a million times where we've got an array, we've got a name that we want to use on the type ahead to display the user, but all we care about is submitting an ID to the back end because that's how we're associating our values in the database. All right, so how do I handle this? We're going to wrap our component and control value, control it, CVA, I cannot talk right now, interface, and it's going to solve all our problems. So let's go ahead and start building our wrapper. And so if you've ever like done any custom directive building or your own form elements, very much the same idea going on here. So the first thing we're going to do is import everything we need. So we need our control value accessor interface, obviously. And I'll talk through a couple of these guys later that we'll need. But we're going to go ahead and use forward ref that is going to push everything forward to use our component. And we need a couple things here. We talked through that we need our register unchanged function, our register untouched function, and our write value function. And this is kind of just a basic pattern that I start with whenever I'm having to create a new element. We're also going to have an input of value, which is going to collect our value that we pass in from the form control name and the parent form. That'll solve a lot of problems for us. And I've got an input data, so if I have some sort of list or something that I'm using in my type ahead, that's what we've got going on there. Okay, and again, all this is in the demo code. So the issue I ran into, I was using NGX Bootstrap, which is a fairly popular library for all these different components, but I was like, come on, type ahead drama, really? So this is what my markup looks like for my component, and so I've got my implementation of the type ahead. In this case, I'm using the template functionality because remember, we want to display the name to the user. That's what we care about, but we want to submit the ID. And so other than that, like everything is just according to NGX Bootstrap documentation. Like we don't have to do any craziness there. So we're good to go. And then when we finally hook it into our form, this is really all we need. We've got our new component that we've created. We're just passing in our same form control name. We're just treating it as a normal input value, right? And then if we're having to pass in a list of something, you know, I've got my recipes input that is listening to that. But this is all we need, y'all. Like, no custom output events, no anything. It's so clean, it's so readable, you know exactly what's going on. I am here for it. Okay, so what if you've got a form, right, and it's a form that you might either use to create a new component, or maybe you've got something that already exists and you need to go in and edit it. So that means I have to figure out how to pre-populate my existing values to my control value accessor wrapper. We already have this done through our input value. So again, we're not having to like bind a bunch of extra inputs or outputs to our component. We have access to everything we need just with that input value. So, yay. So we talked about, you know, just wrapping this for whenever we're having library issues and things like that. But we don't have to limit ourselves to just that. Like if you have some sort of form, and maybe in this case, you know that you're constantly having to make a call to an API to populate a certain amount of list values, right? We can go ahead and we can start to create forms that we're always going to be calling that same list because we're always going to need to use it, and then can just dump that into our forms instead of having to repeat a lot of code. So you can really nicely abstract and componentize some of your pieces just using a control value accessor. All right, problem number 4. I have a bunch of checkboxes and I need to submit an array of selected IDs. Come on, arrows. All right. Control value accessor to the rescue again. Yeah, y'all. I told you I'm obsessed, and you're all gonna like walk out. You're gonna be like, yeah, CVA, and people are gonna be like, what the fuck talk did you go to? And you'll be like, oh, you missed out, yo. And then they'll be like, I write React, and then you know how that fight goes. Okay, so let's look at an implementation for if we're going to handle checkboxes. And so this is one of those cases where, again, like I'm seeing a recurring pattern throughout my application that I'm building the same sort of thing out. So I'm going to go ahead and create a wrapper for it that'll allow me to dump it in really easily. So we've got all our basic functions that we've talked through in here. And let's look at just how we're going to manage our checkboxes. And so we want an array. That's what we're going to be dealing with. And the array is what we're going to be passing up to our parent form. So we can do all our manipulation here. So as we check select boxes, as we remove them, we can do all that code in here. And the great thing is it's contained here, and the parent form never has to know anything about it. All the parent form cares about is getting the value at the end of the day, right? So that makes this a really great and elegant solution to work with. So simply just pushing to my array based on new checkboxes we're adding or removing. Nothing too crazy there. Our basic component markup here. And obviously you could very much refactor this to be a lot cleaner, but I want to be super transparent for you all, where I've got my checkboxes. If it's selected, I'm going to have something to remove the an output to remove the checkbox. If it's not selected, a way to select the checkbox, and that's going to emit. And again, this is all within our CVA form, so the parent form knows nothing about this. This is our nice, pretty wrapper to hide all our crazy logic. Okay. And finally, when we populate it back to our parent form, again, we've got our form control name as subcategory. Our parent control is wanting just that array of checkboxes. And in this case, I'm feeding in whatever those categories might be that I want to select. But that's still all we got going on, right? Pretty clean, pretty readable? Yeah. You getting on the CVA train yet? Yeah. All right. Okay, finally, problem number 5. I need to dynamically remove and add form controls and form groups. Has anybody run into this before? Has anybody run into it and written some code and you're like, oh, it's ugly, it's ugly. And you know there's got to be a better way. There's always a better way, right? Okay, so I'm a very visual person, and so I just want to make sure y'all are on the same page for when we're extracting. This is my very beautiful UI. Put a lot of effort into it, classy. But let's say I'm building a recipe and I could add an infinite amount of ingredients. And those ingredients, just because I'm not that great of a UI developer, are going to have a name and an amount in them. So just want to give you that visual, and then we're obviously going to be able to add and remove ingredients dynamically. That's what we care about. All right, so when we create our nested form, we've got those ingredients, and this can be any number of ingredients. And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a form builder array that's going to contain everything. And again, we want to keep this as dynamic as possible, right? Okay. So if we want to go ahead and add a nested form group, this is how we're going to do it. Is we're going to go ahead and we're going to grab our ingredients form array from the parent form, And then we can go through, and as we want to, we can create a new form group. So that's going to be our name and our amount. And then we can push that to our ingredient form group array. That's all we have going on. So nothing too crazy there, but that's going to handle that dynamic part for us, where we're going to have that created, and it's going to go into our form nicely and be a very readable output. What if we want to remove? Okay, we can go in again. We're going to go through our array, and we can actually use just remove at index, and as long as we have that populated in our markup correctly, where you can see I've just got my basic for statement, and I have that index one. We can go through and remove our ingredient there. So that is all that effort takes. The thing you need to know about when you're iterating through your form controls is here's where we get started, right? We've got our let ingredient of recipe controls.ingredient. So that's going to be each group of our array. And we're going to iterate through those. But the important thing you need to do is just like in when you're creating a reactive form group, you need to make sure that you're passing your nested form group in. Okay? All right. How do I validate this? Because if you think of validation, we're typically going in and we're looking at one value and saying, okay, is this valid, is this not valid? But when we're dealing with a dynamic number of controls, like that can be kind of squirrely. So we can go ahead and we'll start at our top level form where we're iterating through all our controls. Again, like our form is just a basic object, so we're going to get the field. But what happens if instead of a field, it's a form array like our ingredients, right? Like that's not going to work. So we can just do a super quick check here to see if our controls property exists on our form group, and then if we know that it's a form group, a form control, we can go ahead and mark that as touch. We're good to go. Okay, well, what if it has controls, which means it's its own like nested piece? It's a form array. Okay, then we can go ahead and iterate through our form array, drop down into each form control inside of there, and go ahead and handle our marking as touch for our validation of untouched fields as we need to. Again, if you are going even more in depth, like maybe for some reason you have requirements where your ingredients, you even need to nest values within that, you can absolutely abstract this into some sort of recursive function that will continue to do this pattern for as long as your insane form could be. Okay, a couple tips and tricks. Is that? Yeah, okay. So one of the sketchy situations you can get into is listening on form controls and acting on them, because you can very easily get into loops where you're constantly listening and updating a change. So again, this is kind of a quirky thing that I still actually haven't found where it's explicitly explained in the documentation, so I'm just going to give it here to you. But there's this great little option you can pass in called emit event. So if you're listening on something and making a change to it, obviously when you make a change, it's going to emit an event. But if for some reason you're in some crazy situation where you don't want that event to emit because you know exactly what you've done and you don't want to rely on that anymore, you can do emit event false, and that will solve a lot of your problems. And if anybody ever finds this explained in their documentation, I'd love the link to it so I can include it in this presentation, but yeah, still haven't found it yet. But this can absolutely get you out of a lot of very sticky situations. So in summary, reactive forms, yay, we like them a lot. Custom requiredness and validation, actually not that hard to pull off once you're using reactive forms and understand everything you have available to you. Control value accessors can solve almost any form issue. Haven't run into one yet, but I'm sure there is out there. Maybe forms really aren't that complicated. Avril Lavigne is definitely timeless. Demo code is available here. If you're curious, this is Avril's new single, Head Above Water. It is very, very good. All right, if you want links to the slides, they are available here. I don't think, is there a way to rate sessions at RVA? Okay. Give feedback to the organizers, let them know what you hated, what you loved about speakers. That feedback is really, really valuable for us. That's all I got for you. I can answer questions if you want, but have a lovely day, you wonderful humans.